Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast. Our host today is again Chris Bezic from the Talking Newspaper. In this episode, we take an insightful journey through the Avro Heritage Museum's history with Terry Barnes, the chair of the Trustees. Discover how this remarkable museum came to be on the site of the former Woodford airfield and factory, from the airfield's closure in 2011 to the museum's grand opening in 2015. Terry shares fascinating stories about the museum's highlights, including the Vulcan bomber, the Lancaster cockpit replica, as well as the unique artefacts that tell the story of Avro's aviation history. Join us as we explore the legacy of Avro and the incredible innovations that emerge from this historic site.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of The Woodford Story. And today is our first proper visit to the Avro Heritage Museum on the site of the former airfield and factory. And what better guide could we have than Terry Barnes, who is chair of the trustees of this Avro Heritage Museum. Okay, Terry. In an earlier episode, we got the full history of the site, and that took us to 2011 when suddenly it closed. Can you take the story up from there? What happened then? If you look out of the window now, huge housing estate, we've got a thriving museum. How did we get from 2011 to present day?
Well, in 2011, when the site was closed, the whole of the aerodrome site was given approval for housing for 950 houses. But part of that deal was that BAE Systems agreed to fund the building and the renovation and the restoration of the old fire station into the museum we have today. So from 2013, work started on the site, and we took possession in May 2015 and opened to the public in November 2015. But it wasn't the first heritage museum or centre on the site. There had been one on the site for 15 years prior to 2011, where some ex-Avro employees were allowed by BAE Systems to set up a heritage centre, which was open to pre-booked visits. Not many, but there was still a heritage centre here, and it was that inspired BAE Systems, who very luckily and good for them believed in heritage and protecting the heritage, and so they supported the building of the new museum, and they actually underwrote our first year costs.
Now, the museum's run by a trust of which you're chair. Could you just explain how does that work?
Yes, well, we are a trust, and we're a company limited by guarantee, a charity. We have 7 trustees and a board of management which run the museum as well. So the trustees are very hands-on, actually. So the trust was founded in 2012 as a charity, and we've since then have added quite a few extra people from not just from ex-BAE employees and ex-Avro employees. They're regrettably getting fewer and fewer as age takes its toll, but we have expanded on since then. And so the trust now is a very important part of what we're doing, and certainly with our future plans.
When you go into the museum and you go up to what's called the mezzanine, you're able to look down. It's quite an interesting vista. There are murals around the walls, and there's different colour coding, and that's all to do, isn't it, with the mission of the museum? Could you explain the murals and then explain the colour coding, if you don't mind?
Yes, the murals are stunning. I have to say they're absolutely stunning, but they originated, and they were in the Avro Chatterton plant, in the dining hall of the Chatterton plant, and they were saved when the Chatterton plant was closed. They were put into storage, and although in not very good shape, they were luckily saved, bought here, and they were repainted in areas that were needed. They were renovated actually by the artists who created them in the first place, which was a great bonus. And it's amazing that they fit perfectly in our building, in our main museum hall. And most people think that they were actually made for our museum. But coincidentally and luckily, they fit absolutely perfectly. So those are the murals. But then we have, which is almost unique, I think, in world museums, we have a timeline. Because Avro won his first prize with his model flight, from the Daily Mail of £75, which was the equivalent of £5,000 at the time. And so we have a timeline from 1907 round to 2011, which shows all the different aircraft, the key aircraft that Avro built, plus their numbers and how long they were being built for, how long their building cycle was. And by way of example, in the very early days, you'd have 1-offs and 2-offs and 3-offs because everything was developing fast. And then at the outbreak of the First World War, and you look at 1911 and 1912 and 1913, in 1913, the aircraft that made the company, the Avro 504, of which 10,000 were made. And so the timeline will show that there were 10,000 made, and that it actually was the trainer for the RAF until 1930. Each of the timelines and each of the aircraft has a different colour, and that colour is then represented on a storyboard beneath the actual area for that time. So it all fits in very well, and I have to say the number of visitors who see these are quite taken aback because it is quite unique.
It's the Avro Heritage Museum, 20,000 aircraft built here. So when you come to the museum, you're going to see aircraft, aren't you? What are the highlights amongst the actual aircraft that you can see?
Well, our highlights are primarily we've got a complete anti-flash white Vulcan bomber, XM603. First flew in November 1963 and arrived here on her last flight when she was retired in March 1982. Flown in by the then test pilot, Charles Masefield, a very famous pilot, who became Sir Charles Masefield and became a mainboard director of BAE Systems and chief executive of Avro in the Northwest. So we have that, and that is an absolute highlight. She sits outside. A lot of work has been done on her. We now can open the bomb doors. All her lights operate, and we can take people in the cockpit. And we also actually, 2 of her engine bays are empty because the engines were given to other Vulcans in the country. In fact, one of the engines was given to the last flying Vulcan, 558, which regrettably no longer flies. But in those empty engine bays, we have got some very loud speakers and a very good supporter, a great supporter of the museum, who was actually a sound engineer on Star Wars film. He went and recorded the engines of a Vulcan, and we now play them through the engine bays on our Vulcan, and it sounds very realistic. So that's the Vulcan. And then inside the museum, we have got a Lancaster cockpit. And this Lancaster cockpit is admittedly a replica, an educational replica of S. Sugar. And S. Sugar was the first Allied bomber to do 100 operations during the war. When you think that the majority only did 25 if they were lucky, or 30, it did 100. It ended up doing 137 and survived the war. And so S. Sugar, this is a replica, an educational replica, built by the son of the ground engineer who looked after S. Sugar during the war, and in memory of the 55,000 crew who never made it, and in honour of his father. Everything inside is original, so it is absolutely amazing. And as far as we know, it is the only Lancaster cockpit that you can go in anywhere in the world throughout the year, and I have to say for only £2. A lot of the items are all original in the cockpit, and one of the most famous ones is an H2S radar system, which turned out to be a ground mapping system which greatly aided bombing runs and navigation. But the story behind that is there was a Blenheim during the war which was testing this H2S system to hunt night fighters. But as they were coming into land, by good fortune, they suddenly realised they were also radar mapping the terrain. And this meant that from navigation point of view, it was made bombing far more accurate and made their navigation approaches far more accurate than hitherto, particularly at night time, because they could ground map in the dark. So what happened then was this was all happening in 1944. So Lancasters were given the H2S ground mapping system at the same time as the Pathfinders, mostly Mosquitoes, were able to approach target, drop flares for accuracy. So the combined approach of the Pathfinders plus the ground mapping system meant that the bombing accuracy was more than 20 times more accurate than at the start of the war. If you were able to be within 5 miles of your target, you were doing pretty well. Once they'd got Pathfinder plus H2S, you were able to be within 1 to half a mile of your target. And that meant that the destruction that the Allies were able to impart upon the Ruhr factory dignitaries was far greater, and therefore the enemy, the Germans, were unable to recover as quickly as they might. And a lot of people say that without that, the war would have been extended a lot further. So there are several other highlights as well, most of them in store at the moment, which is why we need a new building. But we've got an Avro 707, which there were 5 707s built, which were a third of the size of the Vulcan, and they were built in 1949 and early 1950s, 5 of them, to test the delta wing concept. Avro's being the first company in the world to fly a delta wing jet in September 1949. Then we have also a Shackleton, the Avro Shackleton, very famous maritime reconnaissance aircraft, and that unfortunately at the moment is in bits. It's the largest airfix kit in Europe, I believe, but that will be built and will be in our new building. So those are the main highlights of what we have today, but there is so much to see, and we have got various other items. We have a Nimrod sonar buoy station where you can drop sonar buoys and listen for enemy submarines, and we've got a virtual reality of a bomb raid over Berlin. That's an interesting concept. During the war, Winfried Vaughan Thomas flew in 1943 on a raid over to Berlin with his sound engineer in a Lancaster, knowing that they more than likely only had a 30% chance of not returning home. However, they did. But by good fortune, the BBC unearthed and found the original soundtrack of the raid they were in, with recordings of the crew during the raid, and it was turned into a virtual reality 15-minute film, and we're the only museum in the world to have it. So that is a real highlight for a lot of our visitors.
And it's not just aircraft. There are 30,000 artefacts. That's an awful lot, isn't it? I was walking around, some things just take your eye. I was a bit taken by an aircraft seat that had a particular history. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's
sat in by somebody very famous.
So this will be Churchill's chair. Yeah. Yes, during the war, the Avro York was built. It was a follow-on from the Lancaster, a fantastic aircraft, very safe aircraft, and much sought after by the dignitaries to fly to various places during the war. 4 Merlin engines, so exactly the same as a Lancaster in terms of number of engines, but a fantastic aircraft. During the war, Churchill would fly to several places. Quite amazingly, he would be in North Africa. He'd be in many, many places during the war in the York, and his York was called Ascalon. In an Ascalon, he had a seat. His seat is green, as it happens. There were 3 other seats. There was a purple one for the King, there was a blue one for Mountbatten, and there was a black one, which happened to be for Field Marshal Schmutz of South Africa. And the only chair to survive is Churchill's chair, the green chair, which was very fortunately recovered from a skip by Harry Holmes, one of the founders of the museum, and a staunch ex-Avro employee, and he managed to pick it up from this skip, and we have it on display in the museum. So it is an absolutely unique artifact. Unfortunately, all the other ones that were used for George VI and Schmutz and Mountbatten didn't survive, but luckily Churchill's chair survived, and we have it in the museum.
Terry, what the museum reminds us of is that there were some brilliant people who worked here, weren't there, who had ideas way ahead of the time. The story that struck me was the one about the napkin. Tell us about that and a bit of aircraft design.
Yes, perhaps, and certainly maybe we're biased, but I think it's generally considered by aviation enthusiasts. Roy Chadwick was perhaps the foremost aircraft designer of the 20th century, certainly from 1914 through until his death in 1947. In, unfortunately, a Tudor crash on a test flight. And such was his relationship with Elliott Verdon Roe, with AV as he was called. The history goes that in 1911, AV Roe and Co. had moved up to Manchester. The family were pouring money into AV Roe and Co., but they were down at Brooklands and Putney and down in London, and there were no real investors at the time. People didn't. A lot of the thinking was man shouldn't fly. It shouldn't be done. like having a red flag in front of a car, similar thinking that one shouldn't do it. But in 1911, the Avro was now up in Manchester at Newton Mills and Brownfield Mills. And in walked, at 18 years of age, Roy Chadwick and said, Mr. Elliot Verdenroe, I want to work for you. And that was a great moment in aviation history because they developed a fantastic relationship. And in fact, Chadwick, even at a very young age, was very involved in the design of the 504, which to many people, and certainly for 20 years, was the basis of all aircraft design and manufacture. And their methodology. So Roy and AV were like brothers. But in 1928, after the First World War, things got very tight. And AV, Rowe and Co. had to sell shares, had to find partners to come and help them to survive. During that period, after the First World War, which of course also suffered from Spanish flu and so on and so forth, they even took to making coffins, billiard tables, a three-wheeler car called a Harper, one of which we are getting from Brooklands for our collection in the next month or so. And so they also started to make cars. And the interesting fact about that was that one of the investors after the war in 1921 was Crossley Cars. But Avro, that was a minor share, but Avro started making cars, and typically of AV, who it was a great brain, a great inventor and a leading technologist. The car that Avro built had the first sliding roof and the first movable seat, and it also had a special Ecolok gearbox. So that should shows what AV was like. So many firsts in his life, which I could give you a whole list on, but we'd be here for a long time. But basically, in 1928, such were the difficulties still with the company. Crossley bought a major share, bought a controlling share, stopped production of cars, and AV Verdenroe sold his shares, and he left the company. And he formed Saunders Row, as it happens, down on the south coast with the flying boats. But his relationship with Roy was so deep that they always kept in touch. And in 1930, some say 36, but I think more 38, Roy Chadwick received in the post a paper napkin, and on it was drawn a triangle, and beneath it said, "Roy, this is the future." And that was the start of Delta Wing concept, and the world leaders in Delta Wing concept were Avro and Roy Chadwick. And that spawned the 5 small, third of the size of the Vulcan 707 concept aircraft, and which then spawned the very famous and iconic Vulcan, of which 136 were made and all assembled here at Woodford.
You mentioned the tragic accident. There's a memorial to that, not that far away from here now, isn't it? On the site of the airfield, but of course not the airfield anymore.
No, indeed, that's true. In August 1947, a Tudor 2 had been on a test flight on a particular day, and the test pilots asked for a few alterations to be made, and these were made overnight by the maintenance crew. And so in the morning, Roy Chadwick, together with his assistant Stuart Davies, were going up on an early morning flight with the Tudor, which was quite a leader in terms of potential passenger aircraft in its day. Was a very large and very potentially successful aircraft. As it happened, Roy Dobson, then Sir Roy Dobson, who had been managing director of the company, was just about to get in the aircraft when his secretary screamed across the airfield in a car to say the ministry wanted to talk to him, so he didn't actually enter the aircraft. The aircraft took off, and after they'd been asked to vector to the east off the runway because Vampire jets were landing at Ringway, which was at that time was still a military airfield. It wasn't Manchester Airport at the time, and so they had to turn a little bit to starboard to ensure that they were not in flight path, and they were only literally at 60 feet and about less than quarter of a mile down the runway, and the pilot was kicked for a bit more of left aileron just to stabilise, but unfortunately the aircraft plummeted to the right, to the starboard, crashed into some woods, and unfortunately, Roy, who was standing behind the pilots, got thrown out and was killed. The pilots, regrettably, very famous test pilots, Willie Thorne in particular, drowned in a pond, the nose separated from the aircraft, and 2 other people were killed. But Stuart Davies, Roy's assistant, luckily survived, and he became the person who effectively designed the Vulcan and eventually became president of the Royal Aeronautical Society. So a very sad day in world aviation. The inquiry afterwards found that unfortunately, during maintenance in the night, over the night, somehow the ailerons had been swapped round, so left was right and right was left. So when the pilots kicked or turned for port aileron, it actually was starboard, and so it dipped them right down. So it was a very unfortunate occurrence, but the end of a most wonderful designer. Now, where the crash site is where there is now a bypass for a town called Poynton, which is nearby here, and that bypass was opened 2 years ago in March. But the actual road goes right through where the aircraft crashed, and the constructors of the bypass, which is now called the Roy Chadwick Way, paid for and built and had built a memorial plaque to those where the crash site was, to those who died. And on the 11th of November, so on Memorial Day, I was very honoured to unveil the plaque with a little service that was held by the local vicar, because Roy Chadwick and Willie Thorne and members of the crew who died in that crash are actually buried in the local church, which is no more than half a mile from where we are today.
Terry, we sometimes hear the phrase punching above your weight, and I think you can certainly apply that to this museum, because it is mentioned in the same breath as faraway places, Washington, D.C., Toulouse. What is it, do you think, that's enabled it to acquire such an amazing reputation?
I think there are 2 things. One, we are unique. We are one company's design and aircraft manufacturer from 1907 to 2011. There is no other aircraft museum that has anything like that. Plus also, we have a uniqueness in as much as our volunteers, we're all volunteer-led at the moment. That will change eventually when we get bigger. But our volunteers, a lot of them are Avro, BAE Systems employees, and the interaction with the public is in some ways almost unique. I'm sure it's not totally unique, but if one reads all the reviews that we have on TripAdvisor and Google and in our visitor book, it is the friendliness, the interest and the knowledge of the volunteers which our visitors stress again and again. Plus also we have 5 cockpits and 5 aircraft that people can go into at no exorbitant cost. We're not here to rip people off. We have to charge for an entry fee. We survive, live or die because of that. And we hold events. But I think it is all those 3 factors. It's the fact that people can go in a Lancaster cockpit, which is, extremely rare, and that they're not being charged very much to do so. And there's a tremendous knowledge and imparting of knowledge from our employees, we call them employees, but from our volunteers, but also the fact that it's aircraft design from a leading edge manufacturer. I mean, when you think Avro, he invented the first single stick operated aircraft. The Wright brothers had 2 sticks. The Wright brothers actually never took off with wheels off the ground. They were catapult launched. It still is classed as the first flight of a powered aircraft, and I accept that. But they didn't actually go along a runway and take off, and they had 2 sticks. AV invented wing warping before ailerons or flaps were invented. He also invented the first bomb rack. He also, and many other things, but then also the first retractable undercarriage was Avro, in an Avro Anson. I mean, the crew hated the first idea because it was a ratchet and you had to turn a handle, and of course the gearing was such that you had to work very hard to move it in very much distance. But nonetheless, it was the first, and then it became with the hydraulic hydraulics. And then when you look at the Lancaster and the design of the Lancaster and the fact that the bomb bay, it could hold the most munitions and the most weighted bombs of any aircraft, even the American aircraft, which is why it was able to do the downbuster raid. It could take the Grand Slam. But all these items were all firsts. And even when AV left the company, Roy Chadwick had he was basically another AV. He was a mirror image of AV. And I'm sure Roy, and we're sitting here near his desk. We have his desk in the museum. Roy would actually agree that he thought like, and he was tutored by AV, and Avro produced so many firsts, and that's what we're proud of. And we don't believe there are many museums in the world that have the firsts and all the inventions and all the leading technology in the original, in the embryonic years of aircraft and aircraft design, which is why BA club members were asked to vote on what they thought were their best museums or their favourite museums in the world, and we were in the top 5 of that, which we found quite staggering. But those are the reasons that they gave. And when you think you've got Washington, which is absolutely brilliant, Seoul, Toulouse, and so on and so forth, it's quite a feather in our cap.
Terry, thank you ever so much for talking to us.
My pleasure. Thank you, and all the best to your listeners.
Thank you again, Terry. I know from talking to people who worked here that although they're sad that the airfield and factory have long gone, they value so much that their memories of fondly remembered times and the achievements and dreams of those who designed, built and flew those 20,000 aircraft are moments that live on. Their story isn't ended, so thank you for playing such an inspirational role in that important mission. Next time, we go back into an aircraft cockpit, that of the Vulcan bomber, to talk to another pilot who will tell us what it was like to fly that plane at the height of the Cold War. Please join us then, but in the meantime, it's goodbye from me, Chris Beswick.
Make sure you follow us in your podcast app to ensure that you don't miss out on future episodes.